The summer sun blazed over the golden fields of Willow Creek, a small rural town where the farmland stretched as far as the eye could see. Dust rose from the gravel roads. The air smelled faintly of hay, and the distant hum of tractors was as natural as birdsong. Life here was simple for most, but simplicity wasn't always respected, especially by those who had more than they needed. For Clara Dawson, the farmer's daughter, life was anything but glamorous. Her clothes were patched and faded, her shoes old and muddy, and her hair often tied back in a practical braid. She worked from dawn to dusk alongside her father, tending to crops, fixing fences, and milking cows. To her, it was honest work, backbreaking but pure. To others, however, it was a reason for ridicule. The wealthy kids from Willow Creek Academy often passed by her family's farm in their parents' sleek cars, laughing at the sight of Clara hauling buckets or driving her father's rusty tractor. They shouted cruel jokes from rolled-down windows, mocking her dirt-stained hands and sunburned cheeks. "Hey, Clara, when's the last time you saw a shower?" One sneered. "Careful, don't trip over your own rags." Another teased. And their favorite, "Guess some people are just born to be nobodies." Clara never fought back. She clenched her fists, lowered her head, and kept working. She told herself that their words didn't matter, but deep inside, each insult burned like fire. Her heart ached, not because she hated the farm, but because she knew she was meant for more. What no one realized was that behind her quiet eyes, Clara carried a vision far bigger than anyone in town could imagine. She wasn't just a farmer's daughter. She was a dreamer, an innovator, and a fighter. And one day, she would prove that being mocked was only the beginning of her story. They laughed at her old boots and ragged clothes. But one day soon, they would stop laughing when she pulled up in a $200 million tractor that would change everything. Clara Dawson's mornings began before the sun ever touched the sky. While most of Willow Creek's teenagers were still curled beneath soft blankets, Clara was already out in the barn, her boots crunching against the straw, the cold air nipping her cheeks. The barn smelled of hay and animals, familiar and comforting. She would light the lanterns, pour feed into troughs, and milk the family's 3 dairy cows. Her father, Henry Dawson, was already hard at work by her side, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Another day, Clara," he said, offering a tired smile. "Another day, Dad," she replied, wiping her brow. Their farm wasn't much. The tractor was nearly 20 years old. The barns leaned with age, and their debts were stacked almost as high as the hay bales. Yet Henry worked with pride, and Clara inherited that same grit. But grit didn't pay the bills. When Clara walked to school later that morning, her patched jeans and dirt-stained boots stood out against the polished loafers and crisp uniforms of the academy kids. The contrast was impossible to ignore. "Look, it's Farmer Clara," a boy named Ryan sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Careful, don't get cow manure on the sidewalk," another chimed in. The group erupted into laughter. Clara's face flushed, but she didn't reply. She had learned that silence was her best shield, though her silence was often mistaken for weakness. Inside, she carried her father's words like armor. "Clara, never let their laughter decide who you are. Work hard. Keep your head high. Your time will come." She sat in class, trying to focus, but the whispers never stopped. The rich kids bragged about their vacations to Paris, their designer sneakers, their shiny new cars. Clara doodled tractors in the margins of her notebook, dreaming of innovations that could make farming more efficient. She didn't know how or when, but she promised herself she'd find a way out, not just for her, but for her father, her family, and every farmer who had ever been mocked for being less. The school cafeteria was always the battlefield. For Clara, it was less about food and more about surviving the sneers that came her way. She carried her tray, a simple sandwich, an apple, and a carton of milk. To her classmates, it looked poor. To Clara, it was just food. "Nice boots, Clara," one girl said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do they sell those in the dumpster section?" The table behind her erupted in laughter. Ryan, the ringleader of the group, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed smugly. "Careful," he added. "If she sits with us, the whole table might smell like the barn." Clara froze for a moment. She wanted to speak, to fight back, but words fell heavy on her tongue. She kept walking and sat at a small table by the window, alone. But what hurt most wasn't the laughter. It was the way others, kids who weren't cruel but weren't brave either, looked away, pretending not to notice. After school, Clara walked the dirt road home, her backpack thumping against her spine. The tears she had held back in the cafeteria spilled freely now, mixing with the dust on her cheeks. When she got home, her father was fixing the tractor again, grease on his hands. He noticed her red eyes immediately. They said something again, didn't they? Henry asked. Clara nodded, unable to speak. Henry put down his wrench, wiping his hands on a rag, and crouched down so he could look her in the eye. Clara, listen to me. Don't let their laughter fool you. Those kids, they only know how to inherit. He touched her chest, you know how to build. And builders always outlast the mockers. Clara's tears slowed. She sniffled, wiped her face, and whispered, but what if they're right? What if I'm always just a farmer's daughter? Henry's gaze hardened with fierce determination. Then you'll be the farmer's daughter who changes the world. That night, lying in her small room, Clara stared at the cracked ceiling. The laughter of her classmates still echoed in her mind, but so did her father's words. Somewhere deep inside, a fire had been lit. She didn't know how, but she promised herself, one day they'd see who she really was. The farm was quiet that Saturday morning, except for the occasional cluck of hens and the distant rumble of Henry's tractor. Clara sat on the porch steps with her sketchbook in her lap, tapping her pencil against the paper. She had been doodling machines since she was little. Strange contraptions that mixed farming equipment with futuristic designs. But today, something different stirred inside her. She remembered her father's words the night before. Builders always outlast the mockers. The phrase played on repeat in her head, like a song stuck on a loop. Clara flipped to a fresh page and began sketching. At first, it was just a tractor, bulky and ordinary. But slowly, her hand began to move with more confidence. She imagined what a tractor would look like if it wasn't just for plowing fields, but for revolutionizing the way farming worked. Stronger engines, solar-powered systems, advanced AI that could detect crop health, even a design sleek enough to rival luxury cars in appearance. Her heart raced. She paused, staring at the rough sketch. Something about it felt right. Not perfect, not finished, but alive. What's your drawing there? Henry's voice startled her. He had come up behind her with a mug of coffee in hand. Clara shut the book instinctively. Nothing. Henry raised an eyebrow, but smiled knowingly. You know, hiding your ideas is like burying seeds and never watering them. Won't do much good. Clara hesitated, then slowly opened the sketchbook and showed him the drawing. Henry studied it in silence, his weathered face unreadable. Clara's palms grew sweaty. What if he thought it was silly? Just another childish dream? Finally, Henry whistled low. Clara, this ain't nothing. This is something. You really think so? She asked timidly. I don't just think so, Henry said firmly. I know so. But ideas are like crops, Clara. They take work, patience, and more than a little sweat. The question is, are you willing to put in the work? Clara clenched her fists, determination rising like a storm. Yes, I'll do whatever it takes. That night, after finishing her chores, Clara stayed up late with a flashlight under her blanket, sketching page after page. She drew designs for engines, cabins, control systems. She researched online using the old family computer, devouring every article she could find about engineering, mechanics, and sustainable farming tech. The mockery from school still hurt, but instead of breaking her, it fueled her. Every insult became another reason to sharpen her vision. Clara wasn't just dreaming anymore. She was building the blueprint for a future where she would no longer be the girl with old boots and hand-me-down clothes. She would be the girl who drove the future. The morning sun spilled over the fields, painting the crops in shades of gold and green. Clara, however, barely noticed. Her eyes were glued to the worn-out notebook filled with sketches, diagrams, and half-formed equations she had scrawled through the night. Her father noticed her at the breakfast table, cereal untouched, pencil tucked behind her ear. Clara, you're staring at those pages like they're going to sprout wings, he teased. They might, Clara muttered, then looked up with determination. Dad, I want to build it. Henry paused mid-bite, studying her face. He saw it in her eyes. The same stubborn fire his late wife once carried when she decided she was going to plant crops in land everyone else called barren. That determination had kept their farm alive. You're serious? He asked. As serious as the ground we stand on, Clara replied. I don't know how, and I don't know how long it'll take, but I want to build this tractor. Not just for us. For every farmer who's ever been told they're too small to matter. Henry set down his spoon, leaned back in his chair, and let out a thoughtful hum. Finally, he smiled. Then I reckon we should start by finding some scrap metal. Clara's heart leapt. That weekend, Henry drove Clara to the town's junkyard. To most, it was a graveyard of rust and broken dreams. Piles of bent steel, dead engines, shattered glass. But to Clara, it was a treasure chest. She walked between the rows like an explorer, running her fingers along dented car hoods, cracked gears, and discarded wires. Her imagination sparked at every step. Can I use this? She asked, pointing to a half-broken lawnmower engine. Henry shrugged. If you can figure out how, then it's yours. They loaded their old pickup truck with everything Clara thought could be useful. Old tires, busted motors, cables, even a shelled tractor that looked like it hadn't run in 30 years. By the time they got home, the truck was groaning under the weight, and Henry was shaking his head. You really think you can turn all this junk into something? He asked. Clara wiped the grease from her hands, grinning. It's not junk. It's potential. That night, Clara set up a small workshop in the barn. The air smelled of hay, oil, and dust, but to her, it was the sweetest perfume. She laid out her tools, borrowed wrenches, a rusty toolbox, her notebooks. Piece by piece, she began. At first, it was chaos. Bolts wouldn't fit. Wires sparked. She burned her hand once, cut her finger twice, and broke down in tears more times than she could count. But every failure became a lesson. Every mistake sharpened her resolve. Sometimes, late at night, Henry would peek in and watch his daughter hunched over a welding torch, sweat dripping down her brow, her face glowing with grit. He never interrupted. He just smiled and thought, that girl's going to change the world one day. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, a shape began to form in the barn, the skeleton of something new, something powerful. It wasn't finished, not even close, but it was real. For the first time in her life, Clara didn't just dream of proving the rich kids wrong. She was building the machine that would do it. The barn smelled of iron and smoke. Sparks flew as Clara welded two jagged pieces of steel together. Sweat trickled down her temple, and her hands shook from exhaustion. She had been at it for 14 hours straight. Finally, she stepped back and wiped the sweat from her eyes. The skeleton of her machine, her dream tractor, stood before her. It wasn't polished, it wasn't complete, but it looked like something that could come alive. "Dad!" she called, her voice echoing across the yard. Henry came rushing in, his boots crunching over straw. His eyes widened at the sight. "Clara, you actually did it." Clara's chest swelled with pride. "It's ready for a test." Henry scratched his chin nervously. "Are you sure? It doesn't even have a proper chassis yet. That engine looks like it came out of Noah's Arkansas." But Clara wasn't backing down. "I just need to see if it moves." They hauled the machine outside. The neighbors peeked over their fences, whispering and laughing. One even muttered, "Looks like she built a pile of junk on wheels." Clara ignored them. With trembling hands, she climbed into the seat, turned the ignition, and pressed her foot against the pedal. The machine roared to life with a cough of black smoke. Clara's heart skipped a beat. It worked. She grinned wildly as the tractor lurched forward. But then, clank, boom! The engine sputtered, coughed, and exploded in a cloud of smoke. The tractor lurched violently, sending Clara tumbling to the ground. A wheel rolled off, and the machine collapsed like a dying beast. The neighbors burst into laughter. "Ha! Some genius she is," one shouted. Clara sat in the dirt. Coughing from the smoke, her pride shattered into pieces. She had poured months into this, and it had failed in front of everyone. Henry rushed to her side. "Clara, are you hurt?" Her eyes welled with tears. "I thought I had it. I thought I was close. Henry squeezed her shoulder gently. You are close. You just learned how not to build it. That's progress. But Clara didn't feel progress. That night, she sat alone in the barn, staring at the broken shell of her dream. The voices of the rich kids echoed in her head, mocking, cruel, certain she would never rise above her farm boots and patched clothes. For the first time, Clara thought about quitting. But just as despair began to consume her, she remembered something her mother once told her, back when Clara was only 8 years old and crying over a failed science project. Her mother's voice, soft yet firm, rang in her memory. Failure is the universe's way of asking, how badly do you want it? Clara clenched her fists, tears rolling down her cheeks. She whispered into the silence of the barn, I want it badly enough to try again. And with that, the ember of determination reignited. The barn was still smoky from the failed tractor test when Clara dragged herself back inside the next morning. Her hands were raw, her eyes bloodshot, but her spirit, though shaken, wasn't broken. She picked up her notebook, flipping through pages filled with sketches, calculations, and wild ideas. Each scribbled line reminded her of how much she had already given, but something was missing, some knowledge she couldn't just pull out of thin air. Maybe I need someone smarter than me, she muttered. That's when Henry, carrying a basket of fresh eggs, said casually, You know, there's someone you should talk to, Old Man Whitaker. Clara raised an eyebrow. The hermit who lives on the edge of town? Henry chuckled. He's not a hermit. He's a retired engineer, used to design machines for aerospace companies. The man's forgotten more about engines than most people ever learn. Folks think he's crazy because he tinkers with junk, but maybe he's just like you. Clara's pulse quickened. A real engineer, a mentor, maybe the missing piece. The next afternoon, Clara mustered her courage and biked to the edge of town. Whitaker's place was exactly what she expected. A cluttered yard filled with rusted engines, broken down tractors, and scraps of metal piled like mountains. The faint smell of oil and iron lingered in the air. As she rolled up, a wiry man with a wild beard and sharp eyes stepped out of shed, holding a wrench the size of a baseball bat. What do you want, girl? He barked. Clara swallowed hard, but stood her ground. I want to build something. A tractor. Not just any tractor. A machine that can change farming. And I need help. Whitaker snorted. You and every fool who thinks they can weld two pipes together and call it progress. Go home. Clara's chest tightened. For a moment, she almost turned around. But then she remembered the laughter of the rich kids, the humiliation of failure, and the promise she had made to herself. Instead of leaving, she dropped her notebook at his feet. Then look, if I'm just a fool, tell me why. Whitaker bent down, flipping through the sketches. His eyes narrowed. He muttered under his breath, then looked back at her sharply. You drew this? Yes, Clara replied firmly. He studied her for a long moment, then finally let out a grunt. Your math is sloppy. Your structure would snap under torque. But, he tapped the page, this idea, this hybrid engine concept, it's not bad. Not bad at all. Clara's eyes lit up. So you'll help me? Whitaker sighed, tossing the wrench onto a workbench. I swore I was done teaching stubborn dreamers. But you've got fire in your eyes, girl. Fine, I'll help, but on one condition. What's that? Clara asked. You don't cry when I tear your ideas apart. You'll fail 100 more times before you succeed. If you can stomach that, then maybe, just maybe, you'll build something worth talking about. Clara straightened her back and nodded. Deal. That night, Clara biked home with grease still smeared on her hands and a new spark in her heart. She had a mentor now, someone who believed enough to push her harder than ever. And as she drifted off to sleep, she whispered to herself, this time, I won't just build a machine. I'll build history. Whitaker didn't waste time. The very next morning, Clara showed up at his workshop, and he barked at her like a drill sergeant. First rule, he said, tossing her a pair of heavy gloves. You don't touch anything in here without knowing how it works. Second rule, you don't quit when your hands hurt. And third, never call me a teacher. I'm just an old man, making sure you don't blow yourself up. Clara smirked nervously. Got it. The training was brutal. Day 1. He handed her a rusted carburetor and said, take it apart and put it back together. She spent hours, fumbling with screws and springs until her fingers cramped. When she finally finished, Whitaker only grunted, not terrible, but you'll do it 10 more times. Day 2. He pointed at a pile of scrap metal. Build me a frame that won't collapse if I kick it. Clara hammered, welded, and reshaped until her arms shook from exhaustion. By the time she dragged the makeshift frame to him, her shirt was soaked in sweat. Whitaker kicked it. The frame held. Better. Now do it again. Day 3. He handed her a chalkboard and said, explain torque ratios. No notes. Clara blinked. I thought we were building, not doing math lessons. Whitaker shot her a look that could slice steel. Machines don't care about your dreams. They obey physics. You want to change the world? Learn the language it speaks. Clara gritted her teeth, stayed up all night, and the next morning she recited torque formulas like scripture. Weeks turned into months. Clara's body toughened, her mind sharpened, and her confidence grew. Whitaker was relentless, but he also pushed her past limits she didn't know existed. One late evening, when Clara managed to weld a perfectly balanced gear mechanism on her first try, Whitaker finally cracked a rare smile. You remind me of myself when I was young, he muttered. Except you've got more grit. That's dangerous in the right hands. Clara laughed, brushing the sweat from her forehead. Dangerous good, I hope. Good, Whitaker admitted. Then his eyes gleamed. Now, let's see if you're ready for the real thing. The next day, Whitaker pulled a dusty tarp off something hidden in the corner of his workshop. Beneath it was a hulking engine block, unlike anything Clara had seen. This, he said proudly, was my unfinished project, an experimental power core I designed years ago, before I quit the industry. They said it was impossible. Maybe they were right. But maybe, he looked at Clara, maybe you're the one stubborn enough to finish it. Clara stared at the engine, her heart pounding. It was the most complex machine she had ever seen. But instead of fear, she felt determination surge through her veins. Then let's finish what you started, she whispered. Whitaker chuckled. Careful, girl. Once you start down this path, you don't turn back. Clara nodded. I don't want to turn back. That night, as Clara biked home under the stars, she thought of the kids who had mocked her, of her father's callous hands, and of her mother's quiet pride. For the first time, she didn't just dream about proving people wrong. She dreamed about proving herself right. The days blurred together in a rhythm of sparks, sweat, and stubbornness. Clara spent every waking moment in Whitaker's workshop, her hands blackened with grease, her brain constantly churning through blueprints and equations. The old man watched her carefully, sometimes gruff, sometimes quietly proud. He never admitted it aloud, but he had begun to think of Clara not just as a student, but as the daughter he never had. One rainy night, Clara hunched over the power core with a torch in her hand, welding the final piece of the engine casing. She barely noticed Whitaker standing behind her until he muttered, Your welds are cleaner than mine used to be. Clara glanced back with a grin. That's the highest compliment you've given me yet. Whitaker smirked. Don't get used to it. They both laughed. But then Clara's expression sobered as she placed the final bolt into position. Her hands trembled, not from fatigue, but from anticipation. Months of work had led to this moment. Is it ready? She asked. Whitaker folded his arms, his eyes narrowing at the massive prototype. It's ready to test. Whether it's ready to work, that's another story. The engine roared to life. At first, it coughed and sputtered like a dying beast, but then, with Clara's steady adjustments, the deep hum grew stronger, smoother, steadier, like a heartbeat coming alive. Clara's eyes widened. It's working. Whitaker chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. Against all logic, it is. But as the hum grew louder, a warning light flickered red. Clara lunged to the control panel, tightening a valve just before steam burst through a seam. Pressure's too high, she shouted. Back it down. Whitaker barked. Clara adjusted, sweat dripping into her eyes. Slowly, the pressure gauge settled, the engine leveled, and the red warning light flickered off. The room fell into silence, except for the steady, powerful hum of the core. Whitaker exhaled, wiping his brow. Girl, you just did what half the industry said was impossible. Clara's chest swelled with pride, her heart racing. We did it. No, Whitaker corrected gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. You did it. I just kept you from blowing up the workshop. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to picture what this meant. A machine powered by this core could change farming forever. Tractors that were more efficient, cheaper to maintain, and capable of handling terrains that no traditional equipment could manage. It wouldn't just be about silencing the rich kids' laughter anymore. It would be about giving her father and farmers like him a fighting chance in a world that often forgot them. Whitaker saw the fire in her eyes and gave a small nod. Now comes the hard part. Clara tilted her head. That wasn't the hard part. Whitaker smirked. No, building is easy. Convincing the world to believe in it, that's the battle. Clara looked back at the humming engine, determination hardening her voice. Then let's fight. That night, Clara lay awake in her small room, the sound of rain on the roof above. She thought of her classmates, their shiny cars, their mocking voices. She thought of the endless fields where her father still toiled from dawn to dusk. And she whispered to herself, this is just the beginning. The workshop buzzed with energy in the following weeks. What had once been sketches on napkins and smudged blueprints spread across a dusty desk was now becoming something tangible, something alive. Whitaker cleared out the back of the shop, dragging away decades of scrap metal and forgotten projects, making room for what Clara envisioned, a tractor unlike anything the world had ever seen. The first challenge was the frame. Clara insisted on designing it from scratch instead of modifying an old model. Why waste time rebuilding the past? She told Whitaker firmly. When we can create the future. Whitaker grumbled, but secretly admired her conviction. Together, they scavenged steel welded beams and assembled the skeletal frame piece by piece. Clara would work until her arms shook, then collapse into an old chair, only to spring up again with another idea. The engine core, their crown jewel, was lowered carefully into place one chilly morning. Clara's hands trembled as she guided the hoist. Steady, girl, Whitaker said, his own voice surprisingly tight. One slip, and we'll be scraping what's left of it off the floor. But the core slid into its cradle perfectly, as though it belonged there. Clara let out a shaky laugh. It's real. This is actually happening. Whitaker clapped her on the back. Don't celebrate yet. We still have to make the damn thing run. Every day, the tractor took shape. Tires taller than Clara herself rolled into the shop. Hydraulic systems were pieced together. Cab panels bolted into place. And new technology, her technology, threaded to the veins of the machine like arteries carrying life. Clara began calling it Titan. Why, Titan? Whitaker asked one evening as they stood admiring the massive half-finished machine. Because it's strong enough to carry the weight of dreams, she replied simply. For once, Whitaker didn't have a sarcastic comeback. The first startup was nerve-wracking. Clara sat in the cab, her palms damp as she pressed the ignition button. For a moment, nothing happened. Her heart sank. Then, with a low rumble that shook the ground, Titan came alive. The glow of the power core pulsed softly through its glass housing, lighting up the interior with an otherworldly blue. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It's beautiful. Whitaker, standing below with a hand on the steel frame, nodded slowly. I'll be damned. You've built yourself a monster. Clara drove it forward. The machine rolled smoothly, every gear shifting seamlessly. She eased it into the muddy patch behind the workshop, testing the hydraulics, the tillers, the load capacity. Everything worked. Everything. She laughed out loud, throwing her head back. It works. Whitaker grinned in spite of himself. Don't let it go to your head, girl. One test doesn't make it perfect. But as he watched her maneuver Titan across the field with the skill of a seasoned farmer, he knew deep down, this was no ordinary tractor. This was history. That night, Clara stood beside the machine, brushing her hand along its steel body, as though it were a living creature. She thought of her father, his weary hands, the way he always said he wished he could give her more. "No, Papa," she whispered into the quiet night. "I'll be the one to give you more." Her dream was no longer just a dream. It was parked right in front of her. Dawn broke over the valley, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. Clara barely noticed. She hadn't slept. All night she paced the workshop, checking Titan's bolts, monitoring the power core, tightening hydraulic lines that didn't need tightening. By sunrise, she was standing in front of the towering machine, her nerves buzzing. Today was the day. "Ready?" Whitaker asked, sipping his black coffee like it was just another morning. Clara exhaled. "As I'll ever be." They rolled Titan out of the workshop into the field. Birds scattered at the sound of its engine humming to life, and neighbors began gathering at the edge of the property. Farmers leaned on their trucks, wives shaded their eyes with calloused hands, and children whispered in awe. "Look at the size of that thing," one man muttered. "Never seen anything like it," another replied. Clara climbed into the cab, her heart racing. She glanced down at Whitaker, who gave her a small nod. She pressed the ignition. The core pulsed with blue light, and Titan roared awake. Clara eased the tractor forward. The massive tires rolled onto the field with surprising grace. She lowered the plow, gripped the controls, and pushed forward. The ground split cleanly behind her, perfectly even furrows stretching across the earth. Gasps erupted from the crowd. "Look at that cut," one farmer shouted. "It's smoother than my John Deere," another said in disbelief. Clara pressed on, guiding Titan across the field with precision. The machine didn't groan, didn't falter. It moved like it was part of the land itself. Then came the real test. She tapped the console, activating a feature she and Whitaker had spent weeks perfecting: the auto-adjust mode. Titan scanned the soil, adjusting depth and pressure automatically. The display lit up, showing nutrient levels and water retention as data streamed across the screen. Farmers gasped again. "It's reading the soil?" "No way. That's impossible." Clara smiled. "Not impossible. Just the future." The rich kids arrived halfway through the test, their laughter carrying across the field before their sleek black SUV even parked. Dressed in designer clothes, they stepped out, sneering at the sight of Clara in her dusty overalls. "Well, if it isn't the farmer's girl," sneered Chad, the ringleader. "What's that, rust bucket?" "A toy." Clara ignored him, focusing on the tractor. But Whitaker barked from the sidelines, "Shut your mouths and watch. You might learn something." The kids laughed, but their smirks faded as Titan continued its flawless work. Clara guided it to lift massive loads of hay, irrigate a patch of field, and even auto-navigate a steep incline without tipping. Their mouths fell open. That thing's worth millions," one of them whispered. Clara parked Titan, climbed down, and looked him dead in the eyes. "You mock my shoes," she said evenly, brushing dirt off her sleeves. "But these same shoes walked me here to build this." The crowd erupted in applause. Farmers clapped her on the back, kids cheered, and even Whitaker, grumpy old Whitaker, smiled proudly. The rich kid said nothing. For the first time, they had no words. That night, Clara sat on the porch with her father. He held her hand, eyes wet with pride. "You did it, Clara," he whispered. "You showed them all." She leaned against him, staring at Titan parked in the moonlight. "No, Papa," she whispered. "This is just the beginning." 2 days after the field test, Clara's phone buzzed nonstop. At first, she thought it was just the neighbors congratulating her, but then she noticed unfamiliar numbers, international numbers. Confused, she answered one. "Miss Clara Dawson?" a crisp voice asked. "Yes, this is Clara." "This is Jonathan Meyer, senior partner at Horizon Ventures. We represent a group of investors who saw footage of your machine." Clara blinked. "Footage? How?" "The demonstration was filmed by one of the farmers." Meyer interrupted. "It's been circulating online. Let me be clear. We are very interested. Extremely interested." Clara's hands trembled as she set the phone down. Investors? Billionaires? People with money she couldn't even imagine? Whitaker raised an eyebrow when she told him. "Of course they noticed. You just built a tractor that makes half the industry obsolete." Her father, still recovering but sitting up now, looked worried. Clara, people like that, they don't come without strings. She nodded. Deep down, she knew he was right. But this was her chance. The very next week, black cars pulled up outside their little farmhouse. Men and women in tailored suits stepped out, their shoes sinking slightly into the dirt road, as if the earth itself rejected them. Jonathan Meyer extended a hand. "Miss Dawson, we've come to see Titan." Clara led them to the barn, her heart pounding. When the doors creaked open and the investors saw the tractor, even they couldn't hide their awe. "Good God," one muttered. "It's like something out of science fiction," another said. Clara explained the features, her voice steady even though her knees shook. She showed them the soil scans, the auto-adjust functions, the hydraulic strength. When she was finished, Meyer smiled like a man who had just struck gold. "How much?" he asked simply. Clara froze. I'm not selling Titan." The investors exchanged glances. One woman leaned forward. "Miss Dawson, we're prepared to offer you $200 million for the design rights." The room went silent. Her father nearly dropped his cane. Whitaker actually coughed mid-swig of his coffee. $200 million? Clara repeated in disbelief. "Yes," Meyer said smoothly. "And that's just the beginning. We can mass-produce it. You'll be rich beyond your wildest dreams." For a moment, Clara imagined it. Mansions, luxury cars, never worrying about bills again. But then she looked at Titan. The tractor wasn't just a machine. It was her father's hope, her years of struggle, her blood, sweat, and tears made real. "No," she said firmly. Gasps filled the room. "Excuse me?" Meyer asked. "I won't sell it. Not like that. Titan isn't about money. It's about farmers like my dad. People who've been ignored for too long." Whitaker smirked. "Told you she had guts." The investors tried again, upping their offer, but Clara stood her ground. Finally, Meyer sighed, straightened his suit, and gave her a thin smile. "Very well, Miss Dawson, but mark my words. You've started something far bigger than you realize. The world will come knocking." That night, Clara sat by Titan in the barn, her mind racing. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She whispered to the machine, almost like it could hear her. "They mock me for being poor." But now, the morning after the investors left, Clara woke to chaos. Her phone buzzed nonstop, notifications flooding her screen. Farmer's daughter builds $200 million tractor. Meet the girl who changed farming forever. From dirt roads to destiny. Clara Dawson's invention stuns the world. The headlines were everywhere. Somehow, the story had leaked. Videos of Titan's first demonstration were being shared across social media, racking up millions of views. Clara rubbed her eyes in disbelief. This can't be real. By noon, reporters had shown up outside the farm. Vans with satellite dishes, photographers, and journalists carrying microphones swarmed the dusty road. "Miss Dawson, can we get a statement? How did you build Titan? Are you selling it to Horizon Ventures?" Clara's father tried to shoo them away with his cane. Whitaker barked at cameraman who stepped on the crops. But the flood didn't stop. Finally, Clara stepped outside, dressed in her usual jeans and boots. She shielded her eyes from the flash of cameras. "I'm not here for fame," she said, her voice steady. "I built Titan for farmers, for people like my dad. I won't sell it to the highest bidder. I want to see it help the people who need it most." The crowd erupted with questions, but that one clip, Clara standing in the dirt, hair tied back, her voice firm, went viral around the globe. That night, Clara's sister ran into the kitchen, waving her phone. "Clara, you're trending. Look." On the screen, millions were praising her courage. Farmers from all over the world commented. Finally, someone who understands us. She's not doing it for money. She's one of us. That tractor will change everything. Clara sat at the table, stunned. Just weeks ago, she was mocked for her old boots. Now the world was calling her a hero. But not everyone was cheering. In the shadows of the agricultural industry, powerful CEOs were furious. One, in particular, slammed his fist on a desk as he watched the viral video. She's a girl from nowhere. How dare she refuse us? Another executive sneered. She'll learn soon enough. The industry isn't kind to dreamers. Back at the Dawson farm, Clara tried to stay grounded. Her father put a hand on her shoulder. Don't let the noise change who you are. She nodded. I won't, Dad. But I think this is just the beginning. That night, Clara stood by Titan in the barn again, the glow of the moon illuminating the massive machine. They mocked me once, she whispered. Now they'll see what a farmer's daughter can do. The auditorium echoed with applause, louder than Clara had ever heard in her life. The very same kids who once sneered at her muddy boots now stood in awe, their designer shoes shuffling nervously on the polished floor. Reporters swarmed. Flashes lit the room, and microphones crowded toward her. Clara didn't rush to speak. She stood tall, her father's words replaying in her heart. Work the land, and it will work for you. She looked toward the front row where her father sat, his weathered hands folded, his eyes glistening with pride. Her mother wiped tears from her cheeks, and her little brother waved like she was already the biggest star in the world. Finally, Clara leaned toward the microphone. I was mocked for being a farmer's daughter, she said, her voice steady. I was told farming was for the poor, for the forgotten, for those who didn't matter. But today, I stand here because farming is the foundation of everything we have. It's not weakness. It's strength. It's the future. The crowd erupted. Even some of the rich kids who once laughed at her found themselves clapping, their shame hidden behind polite smiles. When the applause settled, Clara added, Dreams don't care where you come from. They only care about how much heart you put into them. If you keep pushing, keep believing, and never give up, your day will come too. Her words hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. Later that evening, as she climbed into the massive $200 million tractor, its gleaming chrome reflecting the sunset, Clara felt the world tilt in her favor. She no longer looked up at others. They now looked up to her. The tractor roared to life, and as she drove it down the open road, villagers waved, cameras followed, and Clara smiled. She was still the farmer's daughter, but now she was a farmer's daughter who changed the story. Her story wasn't just about wealth, machines, or proving people wrong. It was about roots. Roots that grew strong because they were planted in humility, watered with hard work, and harvested in triumph. And as the sun dipped beyond the golden fields, Clara whispered to herself, this is just the beginning. If Clara's journey inspired you, remember, your beginnings don't define your endings. Keep pushing, keep believing, and never stop dreaming. Backhand index pointing right, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and triumph.